He was just another man in a crowded supermarket, minding his business, scanning the cereal aisle like everyone else on a lazy Sunday afternoon. To anyone watching, he seemed calm, collected, maybe even a bit aloof. But if you were really paying attention, you'd notice something different about him. He wasn't just ignoring the chaos around him. He was avoiding it. Especially the little girl whose cries were echoing across the store like a fire alarm no one seemed eager to silence. A child, maybe 6 or 7 years old, was screaming near aisle 9, clutching her arms to her chest and wailing as if her whole world was unraveling. People glanced, frowned, whispered, but nobody intervened. Except one man. And not the one you'd think. This man, the one who refused to even look at her, became the reason everything changed. But what no one knew then, what no one could know, was that the doctor's words later that evening would force this man to rethink everything he thought he understood about right and wrong, strangers and silence, instincts and second chances. Now, before we dive deeper, let me ask you something personal. Have you ever been in public, heard a child scream or cry, and immediately thought, "Not my business"? Maybe you turned up your podcast. Maybe you glanced once, decided it was just a tantrum, and moved on. Don't feel guilty, we've all done it. In today's world, it's almost a survival skill. But what if that scream wasn't a tantrum? What if it was a cry for help? What if ignoring it meant missing the one chance someone had to be saved? And what if the person standing right there, the one who looked the other way, was actually the only one who could have made a difference? That's where this story begins. Not with a crime, not with a mystery, but with a choice. One man, one child, one moment, and one sentence from a doctor that turned everything on its head. You came to this video because something about that title stirred something in you, didn't it? Maybe curiosity, maybe suspicion, maybe a little guilt. Why would a man ignore a screaming child? More importantly, what could a doctor possibly say that would change how he, or we, see the situation? I promise you, we're going to uncover that answer together. And let me tell you, when we get there, you'll understand why this story is so much bigger than it first appears. That man could be someone you know. That child could be one you've walked past. And that moment? It's a mirror, showing us something most people aren't ready to face. This isn't just a headline. It's real. And yes, it's going to get emotional, it's going to get tense, and at times, it might even make you uncomfortable. But that's exactly why you need to see this through to the end. Because by the time we reach the doctor's office, by the time you hear the words that froze this man in his tracks, you'll realize this wasn't just a decision made in a store. It was a decision that reached backward into years of buried truth and forward into lives that would never be the same again. Now picture this. Fluorescent lights humming overhead, carts squeaking down tiled lanes, and a strange tension lingering in the air. It was supposed to be an ordinary grocery run. The man, whose name was Thomas, was running late for a work call, already annoyed that his wife had insisted he grab almond milk and some snack bars on his way home. He wasn't in the mood for distractions. He certainly wasn't prepared for what came next. As he rounded the frozen food section, the high-pitched scream hit him like a knife to the eardrum. His jaw tightened. He didn't turn, didn't flinch, just kept walking. Not my kid, not my problem, he thought. But behind him, that scream wasn't stopping. It was twisting into something raw and panicked. The kind of sound that makes your spine ache if you really listen. Most shoppers did what we all do: eye contact, awkward silence, maybe a shake of the head. "Where are her parents?" someone muttered. An elderly woman with a walker shook her head and sighed. Some kids just want attention. No one noticed how the girl's arms trembled, or how her knees wobbled, or how her lips were slightly blue. No one except one sharp-eyed employee near the pharmacy section. And still, Thomas didn't stop. He turned into the cleaning supplies aisle, more focused on finding disinfectant wipes than deciphering the chaos unfolding behind him. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the girl had been fighting to stay conscious. That her scream wasn't for drama. It was for survival. Her name was Lila, and something in her small body was shutting down fast. Minutes later, someone finally called for help, and a pharmacy tech rushed over with an emergency kit. By the time the ambulance arrived, Thomas was already at checkout. He saw the flashing lights through the front window and casually looked away. But fate has a strange way of circling back. Because hours later, as Thomas sat across from a pediatric doctor in a crisp white coat, he would hear something that would crush him in a way no punishment ever could. A sentence that would unravel his assumptions, leave him speechless, and send his mind spiraling back to every moment he had ignored someone else's pain. If no one had stepped in when they did, she wouldn't have survived the hour. Those were the doctor's exact words. But that wasn't the part that made Thomas drop his cup of coffee and feel like the floor vanished beneath him. What came next, that next revelation, was what made his blood run cold. Now here's where I need you to pay attention, because this is where everything starts to change. That one sentence from the doctor wasn't just a medical fact. It was a key that unlocked a truth about Thomas, about Lila, and about something buried in both their pasts that was never supposed to come to light. You think you know where the story is going, but trust me, you don't. This isn't just about a man ignoring a child. It's about what happens when the universe slams two broken pieces together to form a picture no one saw coming. And look, I know how easy it is to scroll, to click away, to move on to the next shocking title or viral moment. But if you leave now, you're going to miss the moment that flips this entire story on its head. This isn't just a story. It's a test of empathy, of attention, of what it means to really see someone when the world is telling you to look away. And it's about how one man learned that too late, or maybe just in time. In the next few minutes, we're going to walk through what happened step by step. You'll meet the woman who recognized Lila's symptoms from across the room. You'll hear about the rare condition that almost took her life. You'll see how Thomas's past, one he buried and never spoke of, was tied to that child in a way no one expected. And most importantly, you'll learn the truth about the doctor's final words and why Thomas will never hear a child's cry the same way again. But for now, I'm going to leave you with this. Picture Thomas again, standing in front of the automatic doors of that grocery store, plastic bags in hand, watching flashing red and blue lights blur against the windows. The screaming had stopped. The crowd had dispersed. But something inside him shifted. He didn't know it yet, but he was already part of the story. The kind of story that stays with you, that changes you. And by the end of this video, it just might change you too. So don't go anywhere. Because what the doctor says next, you won't believe. Thomas had always lived his life by routine. Every morning, he'd wake up at exactly 6:30 a.m., brew the same brand of dark roast coffee, and step outside onto the narrow back porch of his modest suburban home just outside of Denver. From there, he'd glance at the same row of weather-worn fence posts, the same neighbors walking their golden retrievers, and he'd scroll through the same 3 news apps to stay updated on trending headlines, just enough to sound informed but never involved. His life, like his personality, was methodical, composed, and purposefully distant. Even his job, a remote IT contractor for a medical software firm, let him stay behind the screen, away from small talk and unexpected human moments.
He preferred it that way.
People were unpredictable, messy. Screens, on the other hand, obeyed code. They shut down when asked. They didn't scream in grocery stores or remind him of things he spent years trying to forget. His marriage had been stuck in neutral for a while now. Melissa, his wife of 10 years, had once been the flame in the room, outgoing, chatty, the kind of person who always left parties with a dozen new contacts in her phone. But over the past couple of years, she had grown quieter, and her smiles had become more polite than passionate. They barely argued anymore, not because there was nothing to fight about, but because they had learned the art of avoidance. They existed more like roommates, trading schedules and chores, with conversations that revolved around grocery lists, work meetings, and the occasional memory of better times. It was Melissa who had texted him that afternoon. "Can you grab almond milk and something for Sadie's snack day?" Forgot again. That's what had brought him to the store. That and the quiet understanding between them that errands could act as neutral ground, small gestures in place of meaningful reconnection.
Sadie.
Their daughter. 8 years old, curious and cautious in equal measure. Lately, she'd been unusually quiet, withdrawn even. Thomas had chalked it up to the usual growing pains, new grade level, new teacher, maybe some friend drama he didn't understand. He wasn't great with the emotional stuff. That was Melissa's arena. But something had shifted in the past few weeks. Sadie had started drawing pictures that made no sense. Circles filled with scribbles, faceless people holding hands in front of houses that looked burned or broken. She'd mentioned a girl named Lila in passing once, but Melissa thought it was from school or a book. Thomas wasn't so sure. He couldn't explain it, but there was a flicker of recognition when he'd heard the screaming child's name mentioned by the EMT that day at the store. A name from somewhere deep in his memory, long buried, never spoken aloud. After the incident, Thomas told himself he'd done the right thing by staying out of it, that it wasn't his business, that the paramedics had it under control. But that night, he found himself pacing the hallway outside Sadie's room, watching her sleep, listening for any change in her breathing, like some part of him was trying to catch up with something he hadn't yet admitted to himself. Melissa noticed, of course. She didn't ask him what was wrong, she hadn't in months. But she watched him differently after that night, like she was waiting for him to say something first. And when the phone rang the next morning, with a number from the local children's hospital flashing on the screen, Thomas didn't recognize it, but something told him to answer. That call was what led him to the doctor's office. That was the first moment he started to unravel. Dr. Erin Mitchell was calm, efficient, the kind of pediatrician who could gently deliver devastating news without ever raising her voice. She wore a pale blue cardigan and thin wire-framed glasses, and when she stepped into the consultation room where Thomas waited, her expression was already etched with the weight of a story she wasn't sure he was ready to hear. "We contacted you," she began, "because your name was listed in connection to a consent form years ago. A child, a legal matter involving temporary guardianship. It's complicated." That was the first crack in Thomas's composure. He blinked, unsure if it was a mistake. He hadn't signed anything like that. Had he? But before he could respond, Dr. Mitchell pulled out a folder, one that didn't just include medical files, but legal documents bearing his signature. Except he didn't remember signing any of them. His hands felt cold.
His mouth dry.
She turned the folder around, showed him a photocopy of an emergency authorization form, dated nearly 6 years ago. The name on it, Lila Monroe. His signature. A hospital seal. A caseworker's initials. The walls around Thomas started to spin slowly, and yet the room remained eerily quiet. "You were contacted as a precaution," Dr. Mitchell explained. "Lila has a rare neurological condition that can be triggered by sensory overload. It's congenital but unpredictable. And, well, she recognized your face at the store." That was when everything stopped. Recognized his face? Thomas stared at the doctor, confusion knotting in his stomach. "She knows me?" he asked, the words barely audible. Dr. Mitchell hesitated, and that pause, long, deliberate, hit him harder than anything she could have said. It wasn't a no. It wasn't confusion. It was confirmation that someone had, at some point, placed him in Lila's life in a way he couldn't remember or wasn't supposed to. And as she continued explaining her condition, how overstimulation led to temporary loss of motor control, how the public episode nearly became fatal, Thomas couldn't focus on the medical terms. His mind was digging through a haze of half-remembered moments, strange coincidences, and names that didn't mean much until now. He started to wonder, had he forgotten something, or been kept in the dark? The next few days became a spiral. Thomas couldn't concentrate on work. He stopped checking the news. His routines cracked under the weight of questions he couldn't answer. Why had he been listed as a guardian? Who was Lila to him? Why did her face look vaguely familiar in the photo the doctor showed him later, the one of her hooked up to monitors, eyes closed, mouth parted slightly like she was in the middle of saying something important? And why did that photo make his chest feel like it was splitting open? Melissa noticed his restlessness, but said nothing until she saw him staring at Sadie's drawings one evening, tracing the faceless people with his fingers like he was searching for clues. "Do you know something you're not telling me?" she asked, her voice sharp but scared. Thomas looked at her, and for a moment he wanted to spill everything, the documents, the hospital visit, the name Lila. But something stopped him. Not fear. Not shame. Something deeper. something unfinished. He needed answers first, because there were more questions now. Like why a woman named Angela, listed as Lila's guardian at the time of the form, had vanished from public records 2 years ago. Or why Thomas's name showed up on a court petition that was never filed. And most unsettling of all, why someone called from a blocked number that very night and whispered into the phone, "You should have stayed out of it." At first, he thought it was a prank. But as the call ended and he checked Sadie's room, just to be sure, he knew this was no random twist. Something had been buried. Something involving him, a child he barely knew, and a decision he either didn't remember or had tried hard to forget. The mystery deepened not just around Lila, but around Thomas's own past. And every breadcrumb he found only made the ground beneath him more unstable. What if someone didn't want Lila to be found? What if Thomas's sudden reappearance in her story was triggering alarms for people who thought the past had been sealed away forever? As he dug further, old names resurfaced. People from a group home he volunteered at briefly in his 20s, a woman who once accused the administration of unethical adoptions, a whistleblower whose house burned down under suspicious circumstances. And still, no answers. Just layers of questions and the gnawing feeling that someone was watching him, waiting for him to push too far. But the biggest twist hadn't even arrived yet. Because one night, as he looked over that photocopied form for the 100th time, Thomas noticed something he had missed. Something small. A detail in the corner. The handwriting next to the signature line, clearly not his own. A forged initial. And suddenly, the question wasn't why he was listed, but who wanted him to believe he was. And that's where the real game begins. It was a rainy Thursday when Thomas realized something wasn't just off, it was deliberately hidden. He had returned to the Children's Hospital to request a copy of the original consent form, hoping to compare handwriting samples and scan through any omitted details that might connect him to Lila in ways he hadn't yet grasped. But when he arrived and gave his name, the receptionist blinked at him, confused. "I'm sorry," she said, tilting her head slightly. "We don't have any record of that document being filed under your name." Thomas's stomach dropped. He leaned in, voice low. "I was just here 3 days ago. I saw Dr. Mitchell. I held the form in my hands. Are you telling me it doesn't exist?" She clicked a few more times, double-checked the database, and eventually called a supervisor. But the result was the same: no file, no record of the consultation, and no sign of a patient named Lila Monroe admitted during the past week. It was as if the entire visit had been scrubbed from the system. The ride home felt surreal. The rain beat against the windshield with rhythmic insistence, almost like a warning. He kept replaying the details in his mind: Dr. Mitchell's calm demeanor, the printed name, the form, the signature. Could he have imagined it? Was it a breakdown?
No.
The memory was too vivid, too detailed. Someone had removed it. Someone didn't want a paper trail. And the moment he walked through the front door, Thomas knew Melissa sensed the change in his energy. She had just finished folding laundry and gave him a long, wary look from across the room. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, trying to make light of it. He didn't respond. He couldn't, not yet. But the tightness in his chest grew worse when he opened the drawer in the bedroom where he'd placed the photocopy of the hospital form, only to find it gone. Not just the document. Everything in the drawer had been rearranged slightly, like someone had gone through it with just enough care to avoid drawing suspicion. Someone had been in their home. That night, Thomas didn't sleep. He sat on the edge of the bed, phone in hand, scrolling through old emails, messages, anything that might connect him to the name Lila Monroe. And in one forgotten email thread from over 5 years ago, buried beneath a cascade of unread messages, he found it. A scanned image of a group photo, him, Melissa, and about a dozen kids from a weekend charity event at a transitional foster care center. They had volunteered for one summer, nothing major, just a few Saturdays playing games and helping serve meals. But there she was, third row center. Lila. 5 years younger, holding Thomas's hand with a tiny, shy smile. And standing just behind her, a woman Thomas hadn't thought about in years, Carla Peterson, the program director. At the time, she had seemed competent, passionate. But something about her always rubbed Melissa the wrong way. "She's hiding something," Melissa had whispered once after they left the center. "It's in her eyes." Thomas hadn't believed her then. He decided to track Carla down, hoping she could explain why his name appeared on that form or why Lila might have clung to him like she had. But her phone number was disconnected, and the nonprofit she worked for had quietly dissolved 2 years ago, its website wiped and replaced by a 404 error. That alone was strange enough, but when Thomas called a former volunteer listed on an archived forum, the man on the other end of the line hesitated before speaking. "Look, I don't know what you're chasing, but people who ask too many questions about that place, they don't usually get answers. They get threats." The man hung up before Thomas could press further. It wasn't a warning, it was a plea. Determined, Thomas went one step further. He visited the building where the old foster program had operated, only to find the structure boarded up, graffiti scrawled across the siding, the lot fenced off with bright yellow caution tape. As he stood there, the wind kicking leaves across his feet, a car parked on the far side of the street slowly crept forward. A tinted sedan. No plates. Just close enough for him to feel watched. The window rolled down slightly, and a voice he didn't recognize muttered just loud enough for him to hear. "Stop looking. For her sake." Then the car sped off. Back home, Thomas confronted Melissa. He showed her the photo from the email, explained everything: the missing form, the erased hospital records, the call from the former volunteer. Melissa's expression changed the moment she saw the group photo. Her fingers trembled as she zoomed in on Carla. "You don't remember her, do you?" she asked, her voice brittle. Thomas blinked, confused. "Remember what?" Melissa sighed, sinking onto the edge of the couch. "That woman came to our house once. You were out. She said she was dropping off thank you cards from the kids. But Sadie cried the entire night afterward. She kept saying the lady smelled like fire." Thomas froze. That was years ago. He'd forgotten. He'd never even known. But now it felt like a puzzle piece snapping into place. Only it didn't make the picture clearer. It made it darker. Before they could speak further, Melissa's phone buzzed on the table. A new message. No number. Just a video file. She tapped it, and what they saw turned their blood cold. It was footage from inside their home. Night vision, grainy but unmistakable. A man, gloved and hooded, rifling through their bedroom drawer. He never looked up. But at the very end, before the video cut off, he placed something in front of the camera. A child's bracelet. Beaded. Purple. Letters spelling Lila. And taped to the bracelet, a note with 6 chilling words. "This started with you. Remember why."
Who had sent it? Why now?
And how much deeper did the truth really go? The morning after receiving the chilling video, Thomas and Melissa found it impossible to carry on with anything resembling a normal day. Every sound in the house made them jump. Every shadow in the corner of their vision seemed to linger too long. But just as Thomas began mentally retracing every interaction from the past 5 years, wondering what choices had unknowingly triggered the storm, his phone buzzed again. It wasn't from an unknown number this time. It was his younger sister, Abby, who lived in Oregon. She rarely called unannounced, let alone this early. Her voice was breathless, frantic, and pierced with an edge Thomas hadn't heard since their mother's funeral. "Tom, did you send me something?" she asked. "Something weird?" Thomas stiffened. "No, why?" Abby swallowed hard. "Because I got this envelope on my porch. No return address, just my name in red ink. And inside was a photo.
Of me.
Holding a toddler. But I never had a child." Thomas nearly dropped the phone. Abby had always been the wanderer of the family, never staying long in one place, never getting too attached. She had done some volunteer work a few years back in Phoenix, bouncing between shelters and women's advocacy programs before settling on a short-term position at a youth outreach center. When she emailed the family that she was moving again, to Oregon, they all assumed it was just her restlessness acting up. But now she was holding a photo of herself with a child she didn't remember. There was a sticky note attached, she continued. It said, "You forgot, but she didn't." "What does that mean, Tom? What is going on?" Thomas's head throbbed. He asked Abby to scan the photo and send it over. 30 seconds later, The image loaded onto his screen, and his heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just any child. It was Lila, 2 years younger, in overalls and a lopsided ponytail, clutching Abby's arm like she had known her forever. None of it made sense. If Abby had crossed paths with Lila years ago, why didn't she remember? And why was she being pulled into this now? Thomas opened a private browser window and searched Missing Child Phoenix Shelter, followed by dates ranging back 5 to 7 years. Dozens of entries populated, some with familiar headlines. Amber Alert canceled after child found at unlicensed foster home. Youth worker arrested in neglect case. And child disappearance linked to nonprofit shutdown. One case stood out. It mentioned an unnamed girl who vanished after being briefly placed with a foster companion family during a volunteer-staffed event. The companion family's names were redacted, but the photo attached to the article, the background, the date, matched exactly with the weekend Abby had worked that summer. Lila wasn't just a familiar face. She might have lived with Abby, even if only for a short time. But why didn't Abby remember her? And who wanted to remind her now? Later that night, Thomas drove to a local storage facility where he kept boxes of old personal items, scrapbooks, and files from past jobs, hoping anything, would shed light on how all of this was connected. As he rifled through a folder from the charity days, he found a stack of newsletters from the nonprofit's director, Carla Peterson. Most were generic messages about donations and events. But one, dated months after the program dissolved, seemed off. It was printed in grayscale, barely readable, and its tone was uncharacteristically ominous. Carla had written about personal reckonings, mistakes buried under good intentions, and the danger of secrets kept in the name of love. The final line read, "Sometimes the only way to protect the innocent is to let them forget." Thomas stared at the sentence, heart pounding, as if it were meant for him alone. Suddenly, his phone buzzed again. It was Melissa this time. Her voice shook. "Tom, you need to come home now. Someone left something in the mailbox." He drove faster than he should have. When he pulled into the driveway, Melissa was standing outside with their daughter Sadie wrapped tightly in her arms. In her hand was a small package. Inside, a child's drawing. Crayon lines, stick figures, a red house. A tall man, and a little girl holding hands. Written across the top in childish handwriting were the words, "I miss you, Daddy." Beneath the paper was a second note, one that felt like a knife to the spine. "Ask your wife about the call she never told you about. 4 years ago. From a woman named Carla." Thomas turned to Melissa, his face pale, his mind racing. But before he could say a word, Melissa spoke first, voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't think it meant anything until now." That's when the final, most unexpected clue fell into place, a quiet, haunting revelation that neither of them were prepared for. 4 years ago, Carla had called Melissa privately. She had asked only one question: has Thomas ever mentioned the name Lila in his sleep? And just before Melissa could ask why, Carla hung up. Melissa never told Thomas because it felt too surreal, too absurd, just a woman from their past, slipping into their lives with a bizarre question. But now, with threats arriving, photos resurfacing, and memories clashing like puzzle pieces that don't quite fit, everything pointed to one terrifying possibility. This wasn't about one child. This was about a past they'd all been manipulated to forget. The problem was someone remembered everything. And they were playing a long, dangerous game. That night felt colder than any Thomas had experienced, despite the spring air clinging softly to the windows. The house, once a safe haven filled with the warmth of bedtime routines and the quiet hum of domestic life, now pulsed with a chilling silence, interrupted only by the faint creak of the wood floors and the occasional groan of the old HVAC system. Thomas stayed up, perched on the living room couch, staring into the dark, trying to force some logic onto the chaos unfolding around them. But logic was nowhere to be found, not when anonymous messages appeared from thin air, not when the past was being rewritten in front of him. Melissa had taken Sadie to her sister's house hours earlier, under the pretense of needing a break. But Thomas knew she was scared, and the unspoken fear between them had stretched taut, just beneath the surface, like a fraying rope. He couldn't blame her. A child's drawing claiming he was daddy, a forgotten phone call from a woman who'd vanished, and now a warning about Melissa's own silence. It all pointed to something far more sinister than coincidence. Thomas dozed off sometime after 3 a.m., still in his jeans, phone clutched tightly in hand. But what woke him was no alarm or notification. It was headlights, slow, deliberate, casting harsh slants of light through the front window blinds. He rose, heart already pounding, and peeked through the gap in the curtain. A black SUV, engine idling. No movement, no sound. It didn't belong to any neighbor. Thomas squinted, trying to catch a plate number, but there wasn't one. Just like the car that had warned him outside the old foster center. He stood still, frozen between instinct and fear, until the SUV suddenly pulled away with an eerie smoothness, disappearing down the street. That should have been it. But as he turned back toward the couch, he saw it, a small object on the floor beneath the window. A folded piece of paper that hadn't been there earlier. He picked it up carefully, hands trembling, and slowly unfolded it. "You've been sleepwalking for years. Time to wake up." He dropped the note like it had burned him. No name. No instructions. Just that ominous sentence scrawled in uneven block letters. It wasn't just a threat, it was a taunt.
A dare.
Someone wasn't watching from the shadows anymore. They were inside the perimeter now, making it clear that he wasn't the one digging. They were feeding him breadcrumbs, drawing him deeper into a maze with no exit. The more he tried to find the truth, the more the truth seemed to shapeshift. And for the first time, Thomas felt real fear, not just for himself, but for Melissa and Sadie. Whatever this was, it had already crossed lines. It had entered their home. It had touched their daughter's room. And now it was escalating. He couldn't stay still. He drove to the one place he hadn't dared to return to, the local records office. At 8 a.m. sharp, he was waiting at the clerk's desk, requesting access to old nonprofit licensing files and volunteer applications related to the youth center where he and Abby had once helped. The clerk gave him a wary look but handed over a digital file access tablet. Thomas scrolled through name after name until he landed on something that made his stomach twist. A background check form, filled out by Carla Peterson years ago, listing emergency contacts. One of them was Thomas's full name and home address at the time. Not just that, under relationship to program, she had typed, biological father under restricted awareness. His breath caught. What did that even mean? Restricted awareness? Was it a legal term? Or something far more disturbing? He snapped a screenshot, emailed it to himself, and rushed back to the car. That's when he noticed the cracked rearview mirror. He didn't remember it being cracked that morning. And then the paranoia crept in, slow and suffocating. Had someone tampered with his car? Were they following him now? Every vehicle behind him felt like a tail. Every pedestrian seemed to linger too long, glance too knowingly. By the time he pulled into his driveway, he was sweating, glancing around like prey in open daylight. But the worst came when he called Melissa to update her. The phone rang once.
Twice.
No answer. He tried again. Nothing. Then a third time, and this time, it went straight to voicemail. He immediately called her sister, hoping to hear Sadie's voice, just a simple, normal update that they were okay. But Melissa's sister answered with an edge of panic already in her voice. "Thomas, she never showed up. I thought maybe plans changed." Her words blurred. "I've been trying to call too. Have you heard from her?"
No. No. No.
His mind spun. Where could she have gone? Had someone intercepted her? Was this the punishment for digging too deep? He stood in the middle of his living room, clutching his phone, unable to feel his fingers. A memory surfaced, of Carla, smiling politely, thanking him for his time all those years ago, telling him how special some children are, how some bonds don't fade even when they're buried. And he remembered her saying something strange that day, something he'd never thought twice about until now. Sometimes love is too powerful to be allowed to remember. Now, the pieces clicked in a way that terrified him. What if Lila wasn't some random child? What if she wasn't someone he simply helped for a weekend? What if the connection ran deeper, something stolen from him, kept secret, erased from memory not by accident, but by design? And now Melissa was gone. Was she part of it? Or a victim too? And most frightening of all, who was orchestrating this entire thing? Thomas had no time to waste. With Melissa missing and no explanation for her disappearance, he went into overdrive, retracing every move, every conversation they'd had in the past few days, looking for something, anything, that might hint at what was going on. The note on the floor still echoed in his mind. "You've been sleepwalking for years. Time to wake up." It wasn't just a threat. It was a challenge. He dug back into every file, every lead, and every message. And then, almost by accident, he stumbled on something he had completely overlooked. An old voicemail, buried beneath a dozen saved messages from Sadie's school and local spam calls, left from a number he didn't recognize. The voice was shaky but clear. A woman, whispering like she was terrified someone might hear her. "If you're listening to this, then they've already lied to you.
She's not who she says she is, Thomas.
None of them are. Check the pediatrician's office records. It's all there." That was it. Just that cryptic message. No name, no details. But it was enough to shake the ground beneath his feet. His heart pounded as he drove straight to the clinic where Sadie had been for her routine checkups. He didn't have an appointment, but he wasn't about to let red tape get in the way. He explained frantically to the receptionist that he believed there had been a major mistake in his daughter's medical history. When the nurse eventually brought up the file and scrolled through it with him, something caught his eye immediately. A previous guardian authorization dated over 5 years ago, well before he and Melissa had even met. The guardian listed was Carla Peterson. That didn't make sense. Not unless Thomas didn't even realize he had said the words out loud. "Sadie isn't Melissa's daughter?" The nurse looked at him, startled. "Sir, I'm not allowed to discuss any prior guardianship details beyond what's authorized." He backed away slowly, every step feeling like a mile. His mind was racing, thoughts flying in every direction. He drove to the park, the one where he and Melissa had first taken Sadie after bringing her home for the first time. He sat in the car and stared out across the empty swings. If Melissa wasn't Sadie's biological mother, then who was she? What role had she played in this carefully constructed illusion? The woman he had married, the woman who stood beside him through every storm, was she even who she claimed to be? The truth hit like a gut punch when he pulled up old adoption records, desperate for clarity. He used a contact he barely trusted, an old friend from college who now worked in private data recovery. And what that friend sent back hours later shattered whatever was left of his certainty. There were no official adoption records for Sadie. None. Just sealed files under a private family court order dated 8 years ago, just around the time he was discharged from that brief psychiatric hold following a stress-related breakdown during his final deployment. That was the part of his life he rarely talked about, even to Melissa. He didn't remember much from that time, only fragments of waking up in unfamiliar rooms and being told he was exhibiting memory fragmentation. But what if those gaps weren't the result of trauma? What if they had been manufactured? His phone buzzed again. This time, a message. Unknown number. Just a photo. Melissa, sitting on a bench in what looked like a bus terminal, her face turned away. And then another photo, closer, tighter. Her eyes were red. She looked terrified. Below the image, one line of text. Time to ask her who she really is. Thomas couldn't breathe. This wasn't just about Sadie. This wasn't just about a child's drawing or an anonymous voicemail. This was bigger. Someone had carefully orchestrated a life around him, constructed people, roles, even love, like a puzzle designed to keep him occupied, while something darker stayed buried beneath. All the signs he'd brushed off, the feeling of déjà vu when he first met Melissa, the way Sadie had immediately taken to him like she'd known him before, the way Carla had once held his hand just a second too long as if trying to pass something unspoken, they weren't coincidences. They were warnings. Clues he'd been too distracted to see. And then, just when he thought he couldn't be blindsided again, his friend from the records office sent one final encrypted file. It was an internal report, never meant for public eyes, written by a therapist contracted through a government pilot program focused on trauma reintegration for former military personnel. The subject listed in the report? Thomas. But what shocked him wasn't that his name was there. It was the last page, buried in an appendix. Subject's persistent memory displacement has resulted in a unique attachment bond with a child removed from parental care under sealed psychological trial. Recommend continued narrative reinforcement via caretaker proxy, coded, Melissa. Subject has not been informed of relational origins for ethical purposes. He dropped the phone. It all made sense now. Too much sense. He wasn't discovering a hidden truth. He was waking up from a carefully curated lie. And the worst part? Melissa was never a victim. She was the caretaker. Assigned to love him. Assigned to keep him believing. Thomas sat alone in his car, hands trembling against the wheel, staring down at the therapist's report like it was a loaded weapon. The phrase continued narrative reinforcement via caretaker proxy looped over and over in his head. It wasn't just clinical. It was dehumanizing. He had lived through heartbreak, battled insomnia, and stood by Melissa through fights and laughter, believing their life was real. And now he had to accept the possibility that every moment of peace, every family trip, every inside joke with Sadie might have been manufactured, designed to stabilize him, not love him. But even that wasn't the worst of it. The worst was what came next, the choice that now hovered in front of him like a shadow with claws. That night, he waited outside the clinic where Melissa had been spotted in the bus terminal photo. He had spent the whole day checking every terminal in a 50-mile radius until someone finally recognized her from the photo. She looked nervous, the clerk said. Bought a one-way ticket. Paid cash. Disappeared. But Thomas was done chasing ghosts. He waited, hoping she would circle back. She did. Hours later, she stepped off a different bus, dressed in worn jeans and a hoodie, carrying nothing but a small canvas tote and her old wedding band looped through a necklace chain. They locked eyes. She didn't run. She just froze. Thomas stepped forward. Tell me everything. Or I swear to God, I walk away from you forever. The words weren't theatrical. They were raw, final. The kind of words you don't take back. Melissa hesitated, her eyes filled with so many emotions that none of them could land. But she nodded once. Not here, she said softly, voice almost breaking. You're not ready for this in public. They drove in silence to a cabin, an old retreat upstate they had rented once for their anniversary, the one place Thomas had called untouched by the world. Fitting, since it was now the only place left that felt safe enough for what she was about to say. Inside, she didn't pace or stall. She sat down, folded her hands on the table, and gave him the choice he never expected. If you listen to everything I'm about to say, there's no going back. You'll either have to leave Sadie and the life you know forever, or accept what we've built and never ask another question again. No middle ground. No fixing both. You can't have us and the truth. Thomas felt something inside him fracture. How could she throw that at him? How could she sit across from him and give him that kind of ultimatum like it was a reasonable thing to ask? But then she started talking, and what she said was worse than anything he'd imagined. Melissa confessed that she had met Thomas years before he even remembered her. Not romantically, professionally. She was part of a government-sanctioned program meant to help veterans with severe memory fragmentation and emotional disassociation. Sadie wasn't a test subject. She was a survivor from another failed experiment involving long-term trauma recovery through controlled emotional attachment. Thomas had been identified as the only subject in their program who formed an immediate and positive protective bond during simulations, even while under stress. So they put Sadie with him. And Melissa? She was tasked with making sure the bond held. Only it stopped being a mission years ago. Melissa fell in love with him for real. Not because of orders, not because of protocol, but because she saw the man behind the memory loss. The way he calmed Sadie's nightmares. The way he read the same bedtime story every night without realizing it was always the same. And she hated herself for playing a role, even as she started to believe in the life they had built. But when Thomas started asking questions, the program panicked. Melissa was pulled, reassigned, told to disappear, because they knew if he uncovered the truth on his own, everything would fall apart. "And if I say I want the truth?" Thomas asked, his voice low, eyes fixed on hers. She looked shattered. "Then you'll lose custody of Sadie. They'll classify your memories as compromised again. They'll say the trauma resurfaced. You'll be declared unfit, and they'll take her away, maybe from both of us." The weight of the choice came down like a collapsing roof.
Truth or family?
Reality or love? Either way, something would be taken from him, and the program knew that. They had built this world to trap him between impossible options. He felt like a prisoner in his own life, betrayed by the people he trusted most and punished for daring to ask the questions no one wanted answered. But just when Thomas thought it couldn't get worse, Melissa opened her tote bag and slid something across the table. A flash drive. "This has everything," she whispered.
Proof. Dates.
Experiments. Files about you.
About Sadie.
About others. But if you open it, if you take that path, you'll never be able to unsee what's on it. You'll be hunted, monitored, labeled. Are you sure you want that? Thomas stared at the flash drive like it was radioactive. One choice would keep his daughter. The other might save dozens like her, and the program was counting on him choosing silence. Thomas waited until Melissa had fallen asleep in the cabin's back bedroom before plugging in the flash drive. His palms were clammy, his breath unsteady as the computer screen lit up with folders, hundreds of them, named with project codes, dates, even initials he didn't recognize. The files weren't just about him and Sadie. They contained footage, emails, medical logs, and heavily redacted psychological assessments. He opened one marked Project Nesting Ground, subject THX 1127. His blood ran cold. That was his ID tag from the army. They had been tracking him before the incident that erased half his memories. In fact, it seemed like they were the ones who caused it. There were references to memory suppression trials, behavioral conditioning modules, even an evaluation summary noting unusually high empathy response when exposed to simulated paternal stimuli. And then he found something that nearly made him vomit. There was a surveillance log, time-stamped and precise, documenting conversations inside his own home. Not just cameras, microphones. Inside walls. In their car. At Sadie's school. Even in his therapy sessions. The report noted his delayed response time when questioned about past trauma, labeling it as a positive indicator of sustained suppression integrity. They weren't just monitoring his healing. They were ensuring it happened on their terms. This wasn't therapy. This was manipulation. Control. His eyes darted to another file. Subject SE.A-1139. He clicked. A profile opened. Sadie. Not his daughter by birth. Not even a foster child. She had been removed from a state-run developmental care program after a failed early intervention protocol. The report said she had bonded to the target within 48 hours, confirming predictive modeling success. She was assigned to him, intentionally, clinically, as part of a test to see whether real emotional bonds could replace or rewire trauma in both subjects simultaneously. He staggered back, bile in his throat. But before he could process it, the cabin's power cut out. The screen went black. Then his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Stop digging. You've seen enough." He leapt to the window, peering out into the woods. Two figures moved quickly through the trees, deliberate, silent, dressed in black. This wasn't paranoia. This was real. They had been found. Thomas grabbed the drive, Melissa, and a backpack, and they fled through the backwoods in the freezing dark, running blind between trees and jagged terrain. When they reached the edge of an old ranger's trail, Melissa collapsed. "They won't just come after us," she panted. "There are others. Other families. They use this program in multiple states. Teachers, foster parents, even trauma therapists. They recruited people. People I knew." Thomas stared at her, rage mounting in his chest. "Who? Who knew?" Melissa hesitated, eyes filling with panic. "Dr. Reinhold." Thomas felt his knees go weak. Dr. Ellen Reinhold, his therapist. The woman who had told him he was healing. Who guided him through panic attacks. Who reassured him he was getting better. She wasn't just involved. She had been steering the entire course of his recovery. Every question he'd asked, every moment he'd doubted the reality around him, she had carefully, quietly redirected. And it all made sense now. The missed appointment she called a glitch. The exercises she insisted were too early to explore. The fact that she told him to stop digging into his military records. She wasn't helping him cope. She was guarding the gates. But what truly shattered him was the last file on the drive, a spreadsheet of locations and family names. Some were marked inactive. Others said terminated. And some, like his, still said active. But as he scrolled, Thomas recognized a name from Sadie's school, Mrs. Travers, the music teacher. Another name stood out. Officer Harding, the cop who responded when Sadie went missing in the store. They weren't coincidences. They were part of the network. The program hadn't ended. It had just gone deeper underground. And now they were coming for him, not to erase his memories this time, but to erase him. The warehouse was quieter than Thomas expected. No alarms, no guards. Just silence broken by the low hum of fluorescent lights that flickered like dying stars. Melissa waited outside in the car with the engine running, ready for either a quick getaway or a desperate final stand. But Thomas couldn't let her go in with him. Not after everything he'd uncovered. Not after what he was about to do. The building had once been a research lab disguised as a vocational training center, but now it was the last known address linked to the program that had stolen his life, manipulated his mind, and used an innocent little girl like a lab rat. And sitting at the heart of it all was Dr. Ellen Reinhold, the only person left who might hold the full truth, and, possibly, a way to bring the entire operation crashing down. He found her in a back office, exactly where the blueprint said she'd be. She wasn't surprised to see him. She didn't run, or even look afraid. She closed her laptop calmly, folded her hands on the desk, and looked up at him like he was just another patient arriving for a session. "You've come a long way, Thomas," she said with a weary smile. "You weren't supposed to make it this far. But I suppose that's the risk when empathy turns out to be stronger than protocol." The words sliced through him like ice. She didn't deny anything. She didn't flinch. She admitted it all. But what stunned Thomas most wasn't the lack of resistance, it was what she showed him next. She turned the laptop around and played a video he hadn't seen on the flash drive. It was him, holding a much younger Sadie, maybe 3 or 4 years old, rocking her gently in what looked like a hospital recovery room. He was speaking softly, his voice hoarse from emotion, saying, "You don't remember me, baby girl, but I'm going to protect you this time. I swear I'll get it right." The timestamp was dated years before his memory loss. And the name under the video wasn't just Subject S. 1139. It was Sadie Emerson Allen. His niece. His sister's daughter. Dr. Reinhold leaned forward. "You knew her. Before the program. Before the trauma. The bond wasn't manufactured. It was real. But when your sister died in that accident and Sadie was nearly killed, we had a choice. The agency could let her go into the system, or we could try something new. Something radical. We erased what we had to for both of you to see if trauma could be healed by love without memory. And it worked for a while." Her voice trembled, not with fear, but something that sounded almost like regret. "But then you started to remember. The nightmares. The screaming. The flashes in the grocery store." Her scream wasn't new. It was the same scream you heard the night she was taken from the wreckage. Thomas felt like he was falling through time, every second unraveling the lie that had shaped his world. It hadn't been manipulation from the start. It had been a cover-up. But one that began with a choice he had once agreed to, under circumstances he no longer remembered. He stared at Reinhold, shaking, furious, but also broken by the realization that his entire identity had been built on a foundation of sand. "But why?" he asked, voice cracking. "Why erase everything? Why use her like that?" Dr. Reinhold stood slowly and walked to a metal filing cabinet. From it, she pulled a thick envelope and tossed it on the desk. Inside were pages and photos, medical records and legal waivers, all signed by him. His signature, dated, stamped, notarized. Because you begged us to, she whispered. You begged us to give her a chance at a normal life. And when we told you the truth might ruin her forever, you said to do whatever it took to make sure she never remembered the crash or her mother's body beside her. You gave up your past to give her a future. But the past doesn't stay buried. Thomas staggered back, the weight of it all crashing into him like a wave. He had been a part of the conspiracy, willingly. But now, with the program exposed, with the files in his hand and the drive hidden safely with Melissa, he had a chance to end it all. He reached into his coat and pressed a button on the small transmitter he'd planted outside. Sirens wailed in the distance. Melissa had made the call. Whistleblower protection, multiple news outlets, the Department of Health, all coming down on this place. But just before he could turn to leave, Reinhold gave him one final gift, or curse. She pointed to a drawer marked pending terminations. Inside were files, dozens of them, on children like Sadie. Some had already been reassigned. Others were flagged for data extraction. The program wasn't just about Thomas. It was national, hidden in plain sight across multiple states. Foster care systems, special education centers, behavioral clinics. This was only one node in a spiderweb of manipulation. As the doors were kicked in by federal agents and shouts echoed through the building, Reinhold didn't resist. She simply raised her hands and said, I hope you remember who you really are, Thomas. And I hope she forgives you. He didn't answer. He couldn't. Because the real twist wasn't the conspiracy or the betrayal. It was that the biggest lie of all was the one he told himself. That he had saved her. 6 months passed, but time didn't move forward so much as it unraveled slowly, like an old cassette tape, winding through moments of clarity and stretches of quiet where Thomas often found himself staring out windows, unsure of what he was hoping to see. The fallout from the raid on the facility had been bigger than anyone expected. News outlets exploded with the story. Covert psychological conditioning program targets veterans and children. Foster systems scandal uncovered in multi-state conspiracy. Whistleblower reveals government-backed mind manipulation experiment. Hashtags flooded social media, documentaries were pitched, and a congressional hearing was held within weeks. Dr. Reinhold and several others were indicted, but many more vanished without a trace. The files Melissa handed over triggered investigations across the country, and suddenly people everywhere were questioning the systems they had once trusted. Child welfare agencies were audited. Veterans support programs were suspended. But even as the world caught fire with revelations, Thomas remained quiet, choosing not to speak publicly. He had already said everything he needed to himself, to Sadie, and most importantly, to the version of himself he now understood had been fractured long before any file or program had touched him. Sadie was different now, though Thomas wasn't sure if it was because of what she remembered or what she'd always known deep down. After weeks of supervised therapy and slow, delicate conversations, she began to recall pieces of her life before Melissa. Her mother's face, the smell of lavender shampoo, the sound of a lullaby that used to play on a scratched CD during car rides. Thomas showed her the photos, ones she had never seen before, of her as a toddler, perched on her mother's lap, giggling with cake frosting smeared on her cheeks. There were no long, dramatic conversations about the truth. Just small, careful moments. A bedtime story where the last page made her cry for reasons she didn't understand. A question over breakfast about why Uncle Thomas had moved away when she was little. And finally, a whisper one night after a thunderstorm as she curled up next to him on the couch. I remember the fire, but you were there. You pulled me out.
That was all she said. And that was enough.
Melissa had stayed, despite everything. Not because she had nowhere else to go, but because what they had shared, regardless of how it began, had become real. More real than either of them could explain. She had filed a formal affidavit against the program, testified in court, and cut ties with the shadowed agency that had recruited her. She could have disappeared, started over like so many others who got burned. But she chose to remain, to rebuild, not out of guilt, but out of something closer to love, the kind built from scars rather than fairy tales. The cabin became their home after the house was sold. It was quiet, removed from the city and its noise, but it offered peace. Thomas built a garden out back and let Sadie pick the seeds. They planted lavender in a wide circle, not because she remembered the scent from before, but because she said it made her feel safe. He taught her how to ride a bike without training wheels, how to fix a flat tire, and how to whistle through her teeth. And some nights, when the fire crackled low and the world outside seemed far enough away, she'd sit beside him with her drawings. No more scribbles of faceless people, no more burning houses, just trees, animals, stars, and always a man and a girl standing side by side. But peace didn't mean the questions stopped. Thomas still woke from dreams that felt more like recovered footage, grainy scenes of faces he couldn't place, voices he never remembered hearing. There were times he wondered how many versions of himself had existed in the program's files, how many other children had been paired, and whether his decision to speak out had truly dismantled the system, or just made it go deeper underground. The agency had been vast, buried in funding pipelines and sanitized corporate fronts. The people who had made the decisions, who had signed the waivers and written the protocols, had never seen a courtroom. They remained out there operating under new names, building new programs. One morning, a letter arrived. No return address. Inside was a single photo. A boy, no older than Sadie, sitting in a waiting room, legs swinging off the edge of a vinyl chair. Behind him, pinned to a bulletin board, was a flyer with a logo Thomas recognized immediately, one that had been wiped clean from every official database during the investigation. On the back of the photo was a message written in precise block letters. "This isn't over. He remembers you." Thomas folded the photo, placed it in the drawer beside his bed, and didn't tell Melissa or Sadie. Not yet. Because for now, they were safe. For now, they were whole. And if the program did still exist, if ghosts were still watching from the trees, he would be ready. Because he remembered everything now. And they had taught him how to forget.